Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Social Business Hour number 9. Today we are discussing data visualization and its effect on the future of work. I am very excited to have my colleague and one of the smartest people I know, Mr. Eric Quanstrom, with us today. Eric, how are you?
Hello, I'm just great. Thanks for having me.
And we also have my co-pilot, the awesome Kristen Cardos, our amazing community manager, on air with us today.
Hi, everybody. Happy Monday.
And for those of us who don't know you as well as I do, Eric, can you give a little background to what you're up to now and what you have been doing?
Sure. For my day job, I am the Chief Marketing Officer over at Pipeliner CRM. So it's a, we're going to get into this, but it's a heavily visualized CRM tool for use within sales organizations. And we spend a lot of our time educating on the benefits of using our tool and really building the marketing mix around all that is Pipeliner and all that is sales CRMs.
So I know we were talking off air that data visualization, while it's growing in popularity, I think people are still a little bit unsure of what it truly is and how they can apply it to their everyday work life. So to get the ball rolling, how do you define data visualization?
It's a tongue twister, isn't it? That's the first one.
I know. Damn Z's.
When I think of data visualization, what I really think of first and foremost is that it's an abstraction of data. Data being, hard facts, right? And combining that with images or visuals that communicate information. And oftentimes that information and really the story you're telling is complex, right? So you're trying to make that which is complex easily and understandable through visual means, right? So I think some of the hallmarks of effective data visualization are that it's accessible, that it conveys an idea efficiently, and that it's effective. And I think we can spend a lot of time, and hopefully we will, talking about what makes visualization way more effective than other alternative techniques for understanding things.
So I know, so when I was doing my research, I was surprised to hear that we are primarily visual learners. I think it was at 65% or 70% of us relate to visual data better than written. So for you, knowing that, how do you apply that when you're presenting and sharing knowledge?
Well, so I like to think of it in terms of percentages, right? So 90% of information transmitted to the brain is visual, right? And 50% of our brain, if you were to cut us open and go cadaver on us, is dedicated to the visual function, right? So you're right, 65% of people are visual learners, and that's above auditory learners or even kinesthetic learners, right? So people that learn essentially by doing, generally with themselves or their hands. So where it breaks back, though, is we have a long history with visualizing anything, right? You can think of it very evolutionarily, right? Another tongue twister, where, back as Cro-Magnon or even earlier, we had to determine, is there something happening in that bush over there? And, oh, by the way, is it a tiger? Where all of a sudden I have to hone my visual apparatus to avoid being roadkill, to be kind of, as Darwin might say, the species that passed on or survived by being fit. And that fitness of, the ocular, if you will, translated throughout generations to where now there's just like a ton of amazing statistics out there, but it's like the time to perceive the slightest change in someone's facial, mood can be done in like tenths of a second, right? Like we as human beings have gotten so good at reading other people's faces or other visual cues that we don't even have to think about it, right? It is so deeply ingrained in us, and that 50% of our brain that's already working away, I can see your smirk right there and what it means, and what it, it's almost ironic that we're even having this conversation, right? We're explaining that which is so basic, but I think in business, to kind of bring this hopefully more back to where this audience cares, I think it has some really interesting implications, especially in the industry that I happen to work in, software, and SBizHour, social business. visuals are just so important, and we're going to also get into the rise of the visual as a storytelling mechanism, as a way of conveying information effectively and efficiently. And I think that's what's really exciting to me.
And I know you and I both share a passion for the EQ versus IQ debate, and I think data visualization actually plays nicely into that, because it's taking that, really highly analytical part of our brains, but making it, you're putting into a pretty format too, or those of us who, we may not claim to have a super high IQ, can digest the data quickly and, most importantly, act on it.
Well, yeah, I mean, oftentimes when we learn visually or we absorb something visually, we think of it, we don't even think of it, right? It's effortless. We don't apply some sort of, I learned this because it was really hard and I struggled with the information. No, it was actually really easy, and therefore we didn't even appreciate it as it came to us. Now, there can be good and bad to that understanding or that realization, which frankly maybe is an interesting thing to debate, but in a world where information flies at us faster and faster each day, and there's more information out there than ever before, I think there's a really solid case to be made that the easier we can make things to understand, the more we can understand, right? Like, it's simple, almost economics 101. And so as we evolve as human beings, as we evolve in our jobs, as we evolve our businesses, making our products and services, making our brands easy to understand, easy to access, and the ideas with which we intend to convey easier, or what I almost like to say, and maybe this has been quoted, I have no idea, but I like to think of it almost in timed understanding, right? A TTU unit, right? So the more of those timed understandings that I can get, and the shorter that metric, arguably, the more effective I'm going to be with how I'm trying to communicate.
So that's a perfect lead-in to question 2. So let's get down to kind of the nitty-gritty. So how does data visualization increase knowledge retention and sharing? So I know you kind of touched on that just now in your explanation, but let's go a little bit further into a practical aspect that folks can apply.
Yeah, so any type of communication that would require, or you even want to think about using visualization for, you break it back to the construct, right? What do you want to communicate? What is the audience? Who are they? What are their biases? What are they expecting? What do you know about them? And then what is the data itself? Those 3 things will take you 9/10 of the way down the road, right? So if you can think about all of that, then all of a sudden what you start to do is begin to paint together, all right, this is what I might need to show. Or this is what the data is saying, and this is how I might need to contextualize that data in imagery or design to convey what I am realizing, the insights, if you will, around that data. So I think that, again, it's back to that timed understanding. So the shorter we can make that, the greater we can increase knowledge retention, and thus, once I understand it, it's easier for me to then replicate and share it forward. Right? It's easier for me in a social sphere to take that data and do something with it.
Yeah, I think you really nailed it earlier when you said that when we take in information visually, we don't really think about it, we just react. And I think that is a big takeaway, like just not only the time that you're shaving away, but you can automatically apply your situational knowledge, and that's that human layer, to the data, which makes it, again, relatable to the audience that you're resharing this knowledge to. So it's just, you're kind of perpetuating a happy little cycle.
Well, yeah, the pithy cliche is developed by other generations prior to social media generations, where reach one, teach one, right? So, ultimately, if you're reaching somebody, then you're allowing them to absorb. They get behind an idea, they get behind a meme, they internalize what you're trying to say, and all of a sudden they can share it forward. And guess what? Then their network and their social graph gets painted with the same sort of kind of meme, and we watch, what color is this dress explode across the internet.
Let's not go there. That flooded my stream for the last few days, and it's not blue.
But again, it's an image that translated that and that served as the necessary vehicle for a conversation, again, regardless of how meaningless it is, a conversation to happen around a visual.
which I think it's directly correlates to how successful social media has been in the last, we'll say, 12 months, since visual has had a greater place. You know, putting images on Twitter, embedding video, infographics has really just allowed social media to what was already a very powerful communication channel just really amplify, and that's all just thanks to visuals.
Yeah, I mean, I love kind of where I see tools, techniques, and time really being spent developing out visuals. Because I think that ultimately, as busy people, as people bombarded with information, we have this innate need, I think, to want to make sense of our world. We want to see those patterns, right? And the patterns are what helps give us meaning and connect, the dots together in our lives, especially in business, right? Where, some of the most important patterns are, well, what were your revenues? How much money did you make? How much profit on that did you make? How successful is your business? And there's, hard and fast metrics that you get to deliver every single day, otherwise known as data. Data is really just a measurement. It's a measurement of something that can be studied. So what do the trends say? What do the analytics and the metrics say about how you're making revenue, or how you're adopting customers, or what those customers need, or what their buyer's journey looks like? All of those things are measurements that can be made better by being made more visual.
So we have a question from Twitter, and I'm not sure if it was John or the other handle that asked it, but it's, in what way does a visual force coherence? Clearly my reading ability is lacking. Background data may not simply be a slice of the whole story.
Well, it's actually an interesting question to be raised, because data by itself is incomplete, right? It needs context always, right? What am I measuring, and how should I apply it to any other correlation, any other part of the story? Visually, you can't just have a dot, right? A dot is meaningless. To visualize data would almost necessitate the creation of kind of like a story arc in some respects, right? Otherwise, what does it all mean? Why would you visualize something in the first place if there's no meaning to it? It would just be random noise, feedback, if you will, in the system. So I think that part of it forces almost structurally coherence.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we're all aware that we're not lacking in data right now, but data for data's sake doesn't really do us any good. You need to have the context, like you said. We need to have the story behind it, connecting the dots. So yeah, I agree. I think data in a presentation format is always a slice of the whole story. Just it's hard to tell the whole story in one visual or even a report. But as long as you can connect that and apply context and make it actionable is key.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the challenge, right? Is being an effective communicator through using data.
Which actually is awesome, because question 3 is, are there any downsides to data visualization?
Well, I was going to say, like, one of the downsides could very well be just irrelevance, right? Like,
Right.
You're showing me something that doesn't really have a point, isn't giving me any insight, then it's like, why'd you waste my time? And let's be honest, right? Like, in a time where infographic ascendancies, you see them for just about anything under the sun, sometimes you scratch your head and you say to yourself, what was the point of me paying attention to that? Like, did they have a point? So irrelevance is definitely out there, and as human beings, we're very guilty oftentimes of creating data for data's sake and trying to apply meaning where none exists.
Yeah, I agree, and I know people are highly skeptical of data for that reason alone, just the fact that it can be tweaked. And I know we were talking off air that data is highly factual, but it's how we use it, manipulate it, is where we things get to go a little awry.
Well, yeah, and so we're talking about two what I think are actually fundamentally different things, right? So ultimately, misusing data is pernicious, right? That can actually be really dangerous, because here's the thing. With what we were talking about earlier, when you say how effective data is, how we're wired as humans to see patterns, how we can actually understand things much faster visually, the power exists for almost evil with that understanding, right? A bad actor in the presence of a really good visual story can actually do quite a bit of damage, I mean, think of it this way, right? Like one of the earliest sciences of data visualization was actually cartography, right? It was map making. People back in the history of time actually got it wrong a lot more than they got it right until, we built this foundation of truth, if you will, of what our world actually looked like represented visually in front of us. Now, if you think about possibly one of the biggest data projects on the face of the earth, at least undertaken by one company, it's Google Maps. And their goal to actually have, not just satellite data where you can zoom in, not just road and detail and kind of like cartograph standard kind of data about what you would expect on a map, but also the street view. The view of this is actually this house, this building, this park, this physical object that you would actually see if you were standing right here. All in software. And of course Google Maps' cousin, Google Earth, which for me and my money is like one of the most fantastically interesting pieces of software to spend any amount of time with.
Yeah, I think historical maps, I also have a fascination with them, and for me, I'm always blown away by how accurate they are. I mean, clearly they did miss the mark, but when you figure, the time and that they actually had to walk the Earth to work out the shape of it, or in a boat, some of them are incredibly accurate, and perhaps the scale is off, but they really got the gist of it, which is incredibly impressive for me, anyway.
Or the ones that got it wrong, you can actually view the ships at the bottom of of the sea where they cracked into the land.
At least they didn't fall off the flat Earth, right? So.
Not that that was a likely scenario, but nobody knew that at the time.
No.
Yeah, but ultimately, data visualization is, in my opinion, both a science and an art, right? And so, the art part of it is in that intuition of getting back to what the audience might need to see to understand more effectively. And I think that part of it is where beauty stems from, right? Because we're talking largely about creativity at that point. We're talking about taking data, measurement of objective phenomenon, and then putting a subjective spin on it. Again, hopefully not with evil intent or bad intent, but to really bring about, a realization, a context shift, a aha moment, that makes me the better for having seen that data.
Yeah, so I watched several videos over the weekend, and one of my favorites was from David McCandless, and one of the quotes that I scribbled down was, "Let the data set change your mindset." And I think that kind of plays into the question we had earlier about, a slice or one single image, it does not tell the whole story, but when you look at the data set as a whole, that's usually a pretty finite example of the context and the content.
Without a doubt, without a doubt.
So let's go back into it being an art. I know I've seen many of your presentations, and you definitely have a knack for displaying data in a visual format. What are your tips for somebody who's maybe getting started with sharing data visually?
Well, I think one of the biggest tips, and this is like almost like a no duh, but start with an interesting data set, right? Start with like something that you believe the data is actually telling you that you've realized and that you now want to convey to the rest of the world, right? Either by creating your own visuals, using models, using kind of the techniques that we have to ultimately paint the picture of what it is we should be understanding, right? So that becomes the start. Then I think taking that color or that that idea, that seed kernel, and wrapping it in, again, this focus on the audience and what will make it even more accessible, what will make it interesting, what will make it, how do you contrast or contextualize what you're about to share so that it has impact. Because I think that again, getting back to this whole notion of make it relevant to me, why should I care? Why should I be paying attention? That, to me, if you can take those two things, rich data sets and what you've realized about that data, and then what the audience will want to have a takeaway, and it may be different from yours. The aha moments don't have to be in parallel, right? Especially if you're a subject matter expert in a given field, and you realize that most of your audience is not. There's actually a journey that has to occur there. There's some editing. There's a process that has to take place for a proper or a good data visualization to really have impact at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway from what you're saying is that good versus poor visualization is very subjective, and it all comes down to knowing your audience. And I think that's true in almost any field now, marketing, sales, customer service. You really have to know your audience to nail your message. And that's probably even more so with data visualization. Because what is going to resonate with me is going to be different than what resonates with you, and so on. So create your personas, as we like to do at Pipeliner, and know how to message them correctly.
Truer words, Rachel, truer words.
Surround myself with smart people.
Well, the other thing that goes without saying, and get back to the art, we're also talking about here is using data visualization to tell a story. And what is important about stories? Stories tilt on arcs. They tilt on the unexpected. They tilt on surprise. They tilt on, you are telling me something that I didn't already know in a way that was story-like, that was narrative-based, that was interesting. I mean, it's like if I wanted a robot to spit out a visual, I could probably devise something, very easily to do just that, but it wouldn't be that illuminating.
No, I agree. So how do you like to tell the story? So you mentioned that much like all storytelling, there's kind of the pinnacle, the surprise. How do you display your data to reflect that story arc?
Well, I love to take from the familiar. I think these are just kind of well-worn story concepts. You move from the familiar to the different, right? So you generally want to anchor some of your story to the known knowns. You're always going to want to build upon that which came before you to essentially get to relevance. Once I get to relevance and familiarity, then I can start to introduce surprising facts. Right? In the video you referenced, there was a discussion of the military and military spending and total military budget across the world. All different countries, and the non-visualized data would have us believe that America, superpower that it is, has an overwhelming military because they spend more and there's more soldiers than in anywhere besides China, right? But if you start to break down and tell a more nuanced story about, well, if we looked at military spending as a portion of GDP, all of a sudden America drops to middle of the pack, right? At best. We spend 4% of GDP on military. It's far, in a way, different than smaller countries like Israel or Myanmar. I think was the #1 country in the data set. I guess thank God that Myanmar isn't a world power, right?
Yes.
That's a big takeaway there. But basically, it's kind of like moving from the familiar to the, wow, I never would have thought of it in those terms had this data not been presented in the visualization way that it was. That got me to think differently and contextualize check my own biases, if you will, and to change my mindset ultimately, as you mentioned earlier.
So a tweet caught my eye. It's from Music Adam T, and he answered, visualization can hide the true numbers. 80% is a great number, but if it's 8 out of 10, why go for the percentage? And I think people can often get caught up in pretty pictures, and just at the end of the day, you just need to simplify it And then even though 80% versus 8 out of 10, you're kind of splitting hairs on which is going to have the greater impact. I think I get what he was saying, which you kind of need to go with the stronger number.
Well, just to be amusing, how far do you want to split that hair? Because 80% would apply to 8 out of 10, but it would also apply to, 8,000 out of 10,000.
True.
Right? Which is far different than 8 out of 10. If you really want to split hairs and get to the point. And actually, you're hitting on something that's really relevant for visualization, which is amplitude, right? So size, total size relatively speaking. And this is, without getting too deep in the weeds, this is something I actually love about our own tool, where, when I'm looking at a pipeline view, I can actually adjust my target settings and understand or even suppress large deals that would throw off the skewing and the forecasting of, all the rest of the deals in that pipe simply because it's far bigger.
No, I think, but that comes down to, adequately analyzing your data. I think if you need to have your data set relatively finite to, tell the story, as we're saying, if you keep it too vast, you are going to get lost in the weeds, and people are going to wrinkle their foreheads and kind of question what you're trying to share.
That's exactly right.
So let's move on to question 4. What tools and companies are currently using data visualization well?
Well, again, I mentioned Google Maps and Google Earth, which I think are awesome, examples of how we can best visualize, data in our world today that frankly we can use every single day and is really meaningful to a very wide amount of people. I also think, as a marketer, right, I've got a lot of tools that I use on a regular basis. I think of things like heat maps, right? That's a pure visualization of, almost like where the tool just tells you what's happening, and you then have to ascribe a story. But guess what? Once you see a heat map, it's way more effective than a ranked list of your most popular links on your website, right? Like if you as a marketer really want to understand, what's more effective from a headline or a page organization standpoint, just go look at a heat map, right? It will tell you that story in mere seconds in a way that, like, I could write a 5-page report on traffic patterns associated with a website that wouldn't even touch it, that wouldn't do it justice, right? So I almost think of it this way, right? Like the human brain processes images 60,000 times faster than text. So I almost think of it like the pithy cliche is a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, that actually understates the phenomenon by a pretty wide margin. So I love visualizations that I can sink my teeth into. Heat maps being one example. I love charts, network maps. Right? We're talking about SBiz hour. I think social graphs are pretty interesting here. Org charts, right? Trend lines, bar charts. I even love tools like mind maps, and I use them all the time, and digital notes that help me not leave things buried in text that I really do want to remember and go back to and reference, and that basically hit me a lot easier than a very long, lengthy list.
So a lot of people are mentioning Canva in the stream, which is one of my go-tos for mocking up quick graphics for social. But one of my new favorites that I've been using this year is Lucid Chart, which is a way to, I guess, visualize processes. And that's kind of, I guess, it's taking the data set a little bit differently, but getting down to the how and the why visually is very effective when you're trying to share an idea with a team, and aids collaboration, because you can, instead of seeing a list of like, well, step 1, step 2, step 3, you can say, okay, well, here's your starting point, and this is the end goal, and this is how we're going to get there. And I think having that displayed visually is a great learning tool.
I think I know who introduced you to that.
Some smart guy.
At any rate, one of my favorite tools, and this is actually kind of interesting, I think probably for the audience too, in a B2C kind of context, one of my favorite tools is Hipmunk, right? For pure play visualization in a B2C realm, because Hipmunk doesn't actually reserve any rooms for you. if for those unfamiliar, hipmunk.com, so just like chipmunk, and that's their mascot, but minus the C. It's similar to an Orbitz or an Expedia or a service like that for travel, right? With flight information and hotel information and rental car information. But the main difference and their unique point of differentiation is everything's visualized, right? So rather than doing what most sites do, like the Expedias of the world or the Orbitzes of the world, where they'll list flights out, and how do we pick? I mean, come on, Rachel, how do you pick a flight when you go to Orbitz and you're flying from here to Vienna, Austria? What do you pick first?
Well, I don't like stopovers, so I usually go with the shortest number of flights and price.
Price. I mean, price is the answer for the vast majority of the world. But one of the things that I've changed in my own behavior through using a tool like Hipmunk, they have a thing called the Agony Index. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It's the layovers painted visually on a graph where you can see the start of your trip on the day that you're traveling to when you actually arrive. And believe you me, when you see in a graph that this flight only takes this long versus this flight that takes this long, and the price difference is $10, guess which one you're choosing, right? Like all of a sudden you've forced a different decision, right? Because to decide means to divide. That's a quote I heard recently that's really stuck with me. But it's the essence of strategy. It's the essence of choice making. And so ultimately, if I have a more full picture, right, of the information or the data with which I'm going to base a decision, all of a sudden now I'm going to say, well, I don't need to be in the air for 4 hours when, an hour and 45 minutes that'll cost me $10 more, or frankly is even the same price, will get me on that flight. This is where data and visualizing really makes a difference. And so I love their model, and I feel like they have turned visualization into a business. They've really built their business around just showing that kind of phenomenon and bringing those insights to people on a day in, day out basis.
I have not used that site, but I am very excited to now. I like the idea of the agony graph or the scale. That would definitely work for me. So, okay, we've highlighted a couple companies that we like what they're doing with data visualization. Let's flip that. What companies out there do you think are using data visualization badly?
When I think of badly, I almost think of either people that are creating irrelevant data or people that are really like locking me in to where data visualization would work, but it doesn't exist. And frankly, I think that that's an indictment of a lot of tools out there that we use on a really regular basis, almost every day. And I just would chalk that up to a failure of imagination of either the software developers or the businesses that have an older tool that can't be adapted easily to a more visual world. And so, I don't know that naming names is really going to be a productive use of time, because the list would be really long. Really long.
No, I agree. That was a very smart political answer.
There's plenty of them out there, though.
No, I think one that always
I'll maybe reveal a few.
When we're not online. No, I think for just like a pure industry that has just historically misused data, I'm going to say radio advertising. I did a stint there for a couple years, and if you want to see just list after list of people trying to convince you to buy something with really strange data, they are very gifted. And almost now, like looking back, I know so much more about just data analysis in general than I did back then, but it's remarkably easy to misuse data.
So do you think that exists for most non-visual mediums, like those that play in an auditory realm, say podcasts?
Yeah, although I do think that, especially podcasting, there's iTunes, and then there's a number of other outlets where you can publish your show. So I guess it's hard to collate that into one place. So you would probably pick who's giving you the data, and some sites don't give you much access to it. You just feel pretty good about it. You get the downloads, but there's a lot of other data points that are not shared, like how long is the person listening to it, kind of like what we have with Google Analytics. We know that someone visited the site, but we also pay close attention to time on page. And I think that's important when, yeah, someone started listening to your podcast, but do they actually make it more than 5 minutes through? And that information, from what I can tell, is not always available or at all with some sites.
Well, it's interesting, right? Like, I almost sympathize with the advertisers in a non-visual medium because the advertising is so much harder. If you think about even your most successful podcast where every episode has over 100,000 downloads, right? Like, how many of those downloads are actually being listened to? Furthermore, how many of the audio ads that, theoretically have to be heard to be valuable are even listened to, right? If a tree falls in a forest and nobody's around to hear it.
Right, so exactly.
Does it make a sound?
It's true. So we have, I guess it is a question from Andrew. He's asking if we will be seeing any actual data visualization during this episode. And the answer is yes. We do have some graphics queued up. So stay tuned, Andrew. They are coming with question 5 right now. So question 5, we like to always round out the show with future predictions. And it's particularly exciting on this topic because the future of data visualization, I think we've barely scratched the surface of what we're capable of doing. So Eric, what are your predictions for the future of data visualization?
Well, what a big question there. So, I think really so a few things here. So first, let's look at the trends. So if I were to think about, and maybe this is where you can start to share or tweet, and, add, if you look at data visualization just as a term, it's been increasing over time. I found this term interesting in kind of looking and preparing for this event here today. In a state of business analytics conducted by Bloomberg, 97% of companies with revenues exceeding $100 million were found to use some form of business analytics. I thought that was fascinating, right? So, analytics are part of what we do and going to be growing apace ever more. I also looked at the trends so I looked at Google Trends. Google's great for providing kind of just raw data that then you can draw graphs and extrapolate onto. The interest over time in the term infographics has exploded. I mean, it's massive. It's probably well over 1,000% increase just in the last 4 years alone. And then if I look at kind of the percentage extrapolations where Google's running some scenarios, it's not abating anytime soon. So big data visualization is another term that I looked up and threw some graphics around to compare that with regular data visualization and infographics. And one of the things you'll see is that all the trends are kind of up and to the right, but infographics even more of a hockey stick and even more impressive growth. So you ask me what's going to happen next. What I'll tell you is that those trends don't abate, right? More infographics, more data visualization, more a part of the fabric of business and storytelling going forward, right? So I really think that where it gets more interesting is if I start to get kind of subjective on things and say, what do I want? What would be interesting to me? And this is where I can almost see, and I'm going to fold this back into our tool a little bit. So disclosure, disclosure, disclosure with me working for Pipeliner CRM. But I think of modeling as being a really interesting fork of data visualization, right? Where that I can get into a bunch of scenarios. I can take all of my opportunity flow if I'm a sales guy or a sales manager, and I can start to model out what my next quarter or my next year or what my target, my quota should be, and run a bunch of what-if scenarios, right? I think that kind of modeling can play some really interesting roles because then what you start to do once you see data and once you can visualize, what I should be working on, where my activities are best spent, what the velocity of my deals and my sales stages is, all of a sudden, it's like I'm being handed the keys to the kingdom, right, in sales. Because what happens next is I then decide how to allocate my time. And time, being the most precious resource that any of us have, means that I can be more efficient and more effective. And that, to me, is like, it's taking this kind of abstract concept, data visualization, and marrying it up with the real world of, like, how do I do more with less time? And when I marry those two together, wow, boom, peanut butter and jelly, things really make sense. And I think that the better tools, the better software, will really start to ride that train forward. Because ultimately, I believe that's what I want. And I think smart business people want that too. They want tools that will help them think more clearly, more coherently, that will model data effectively, and ultimately produce better decisions, better outcomes, and better uses of time through activities.
For those listening that may not be too familiar with the term data modeling or even predictive analytics, can you give a little more definition to that to kind of help explain your definition?
Yeah, so if I'm going to model data, it's at the simplest level. If I'm growing at a unit 1 for a week straight, right? So Monday is 1, Tuesday is 2, Wednesday is 3. Data modeling would produce, Thursday is going to be 4, based upon the construct of which your unit is growing. Now, the real world is much more messy than that. Linear growth is not that instructive. Data modeling actually is able to take, almost algorithmically, a series of data inputs and then spit back out, again, some sort of coherence, right? It's taking the right signals and ultimately giving you back a result that you then can base a decision upon, right? I think of the best case scenario of this, and not true data visualization, I guess in a sense it kind of is, because everyone on this podcast, everyone on this call, it'll resonate once I say it. When I think of Google's PageRank, right, it's an algorithm that weights 189 different criteria to spit out a real-time model of what should be the top 10, results for any given search terms, right? So a search phrase in real time is parsed against, this algorithmic, formula that nobody knows what it is, and it's way more important and valuable than the secret formula to Coke, to spit back out any potential search term that might ever be put into a search box, and then visualized our 10 results back, plus the advertising that surrounds them from Google. And I think we see a bunch of models like that, but where I'm really taking more of this is down a graphical path, because I think even top 10 SERP results still mean that I have to mine text. Where I think we can get a lot further faster is when we can apply visualization, again, graphics, imagery, to complex data sets.
So I was reading through some of our notes here for the show, and I think it's a statistic that you had pasted in that McKinsey Global predicts that by 2008, the U.S. alone will face a shortage of up to 190,000 people with deep analytical skills. So with that in mind, how powerful is data visualization going to be in the future?
Well, I think if I was a young person, I was looking for a job, and frankly, I've got 2 kids, so this is kind of where I'm steering them already. It's in being able to make sense out of numbers, right? Again, it's that art and science, and being able to say, you know what, we have a left brain, that's logical and that's reason-oriented, and we have a right brain that's creative, and it's being able to take both of those and create or look for those insights, going forward. I think that those, data savvy managers are really important and integral to businesses across the globe, right? We're not managing factories for most efficient output anymore. We're managing knowledge workers more often than not, and big data sets for positive outcomes. on behalf of all of the customers that would buy our products and services. And to me, those stats are only going to continue to increase, because ultimately every business faces the same sorts of problem sets. They face those crossroads around, how do I make sense of it all? How do I make sense out of the data that I'm handed? Again, I gave the very simple example of sales organizations trying to make sense of their sales, their opportunity or deal flow data going forward that our tool, Pipeliner, will help them solve. But again, that's just but one use case out of potentially hundreds of thousands, industry by industry, that matter.
I mean, I kind of feel it's already a problem, data analysis or lacking the skills thereof, even today in marketing. I mean, it's sad. I think if you read the B2B marketing statistics, that very few companies are adequately tracking the results of their campaigns. Not even just social. We're talking just in general, the campaigns that they've built out, direct mail or otherwise. And I don't know if it's because they're scared of the data, or they just really lack an understanding of what to do with it, or even what to monitor.
Could be all. I think it's answer D, Rachel. All of the above. and one that you didn't put, which is potentially management not holding their feet to the fire and saying, well, what did the data say? We ran this campaign, and what was the result? Where we went out looking for the data that would help us make better decisions or make better campaigns in the future. This is where, in some respects, it's somewhat of a discipline. Discipline's hard.
This is true. Anything that sounds hard, we tend to shy away from.
Yeah. Data visualization, not without its hooks and caveats.
So you said a phrase earlier that I hadn't heard before. I think it was every decision divides.
Divide.
Can you go back to that and kind of expand on that? Because I think I get it from a high level, but I wrote it down. I liked it. I'm going to use it, but I'd like to better understand it.
Great turn of phrase, isn't it? It basically means that even the smallest, most simple decisions, right? Like I'm riding in a car with 4 other people, and we're deciding what to play on the radio, right? Like my decision is going to, if I'm driving the car and I say no, we're going to listen to some alternative music right now, I'm going to divide the group, right? 3 people may hate what I choose, but I'll love it, and it'll be good, right? And then maybe we'll go and we'll decide where we're going to go to lunch, right? And so that decision will divide people further, and they'll have to, say, okay, well, we're going to go here, or we're not going to go there. I think decision making as a science breaks back to these fundamental universal truths that there is no decision that allows one to take every available option. It just doesn't exist in our world today, right? So decisions and decision making means I will do this and not that. Even if the decision is to do nothing, that's still doing something, right? Like I've often heard this applied most focally to people like Warren Buffett, right? Very successful investors. I almost think of this being applicable to investment bankers or venture capitalists or other people that have to essentially allocate funds, right? And ultimately, they make very few decisions, relatively speaking. They're not necessarily on the same side of the fence as a day trader who's looking to move in and out of stocks every single day. What they're looking to do is make decisions that are long-term successful or medium-term successful, and there are relatively few of those decisions, right? So I've heard a stat that's something like this. With Warren Buffett, he makes somewhere less than 10 investments every year. In fact, I think the number is closer to 4, right? And he's the wealthiest man on the face of the planet. And so the discipline that comes in with only making those 4 critical investment decisions also contains a bunch of sub-decisions of where I would even choose to look to allocate funds. But then, like, I'm just fitting criteria upon criteria towards this ultimate decision of, yes, I will invest in this company, and no to these 99.9% of other decisions that I could be making, right? Like, I think that's where it's in most stark contrast. But I was trying to also provide those everyday examples, too, because I think both are useful for understanding what that means.
No, that definitely it made it more clear for me. And so then to correlate that back to data visualization, and I know you had mentioned earlier that when we digest data visually, we tend to just react versus stop to think because we process it quicker. Is that going to cause people to make more flippant choices, do you think, or we'll just relay that situational knowledge faster?
It could. I mean, the answer is asterisk. It might. It really depends, again, on, some of the dependency here is upon the data creator, right? So, like, we almost led this conversation talking about effective data visualization will compel me to do what? What's the impact going to be, right? If the impact is only that I just want you to think about something differently, then that's going to be totally different than if I'm trying to tell a data visualization story where I'm going to prompt a very specific action, right? Like maybe around, I don't know, water consumption, right? Like a big topic that we were discussing last week, right? Here in California, where we happen to be in the middle of a drought, despite the fact that the majority of the rest of the United States seems to be getting storm after storm after storm after storm, So ultimately, when I think about how, if I were solving for the problem of drought in California, I would have to be really specific about the context and the data that I want to convey to really make my case, I might start with a story about where water levels used to be in California and where they are now, right? And tell some things that, again, move from the familiar to the surprising to then what could I be doing or what could the individual be doing effectively to change, should I agree with the premise and agree with, what I just saw. I just saw this story unfold, this insight being delivered to me, and I decided, too, that I wanted to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. How could I be an agent of change at that point going forward? That would be just a little mini, campaign. I'm leaving out a ton of stuff just for the beauty of having this Google Hangout, making a quick point. But I think you get where I'm going with this.
So what you're saying is data visualization is not an easy button. You still need to have a plan to make it effective.
I think planning in everything, right, in everyday life matters, just does, whether we wanted to or not.
This is true, especially in business.
There's another great quote there, though, that's just screaming to be said, right? If you don't know where you're going, any road or any map will take you there.
This is true. But you may not have money in your pockets.
What's that?
You won't have any money in your pockets.
That's true. That's true.
Kristen, do we have any questions for Twitter for the last 5 minutes here? No, ma'am. Okay.
No, I'm not seeing any. I mean, we've established that I'm capable of missing things, but I don't think so. You guys have any questions? Tweet them out.
Yeah, it looks like people were definitely latching on to the graphs that we shared. Looks like it's pretty active. So no, any closing words, Eric? Any tweetable gems you want to share before we sign off today?
Well, this is a subject, again, that I find fascinating and that I don't think, for at least the rest of my career, I will find unfascinating, right? Telling stories with pictures and images in ways that are, effectively communicative as a marketer is something that I just kind of I enjoy. It's like, it's happiness, especially from a craft perspective. We've even stepped our own internal kind of infographic production and our own storytelling efforts internally. So it's kind of like, I almost feel like we're walking the same walk. I'm not just here kind of idly espousing this concept for the sake of saying it. And again, I'm just kind of fascinated, and I look forward to seeing, when I see great data visualizations, they take me and they, when I do actually cognate on them and think about them, I think about the resonance, and I think about the ones that have actually helped shape my thinking, and I just want more of those. You know what I mean? I really do. I get to certain points where, again, everyone loves having those aha moments, and we've all had them. where when you just get something and it strikes you in a way that helps you understand something quickly and easily and effortlessly that you didn't understand before, and now you do something with it, and that idea becomes something that you're just either going to act on, you're going to share, you're going to basically do something with, man, there's nothing more powerful.
So one of our regulars, Vincenzo, shared out a great acronym, which is DREAM, Data Rules Everything Around Me. And I think that's a clever way to end the show today. Thank you, Eric, for joining us. You provided some great insights to a very exciting topic. And as always, thank you, Kristen, for manning Twitter and organizing the chaos.
My pleasure.
All right, everyone, have a wonderful Monday and a great week, and we'll see you same time, same place next week.